Welcome, everybody. It's great to see that so many people of you would prefer to listen to a lovely talk instead of sitting in the sun with this lovely weather. It's good that you came here by this Radboud Reflex lecture. Today we're going to talk about the history of hate speech. I think a really urgent topic, a phenomenon that's omnipresent around the world. In Holland, even our Dutch politician Geert Wilders has recently been convicted for, as we call it, haatzaaien, uttering hate speech. So I think it's a great opportunity to discuss about this topic a little more. And for that we have the honor to invite Mrs. Hasia Diner. And she's an American historian, and she is the professor of American Jewish history at the New York University, and she's here to talk about hate speech today, so that's great. She will give a lecture first, about 45-50 minutes, and afterwards there will be a discussion, and that will be moderated by Frank van Kaspel, who is a philosopher doing his PhD here at Radboud University. So it's a great honor for me to give the floor to Hasia Diner.
Okay, thank you very much for being here. It's kind of light, it's a little bit overwhelming, but I'll cope with that. So it's really been it is an honor to have been invited to give this talk and to give a talk on an issue of such tremendous significance. The topic as listed in the flyer, and as was somehow we worked out, the history of hate speech is certainly an extremely important one, and it's a very lofty one, and it's way beyond what one could accomplish in 50 minutes. And it is also well beyond my very limited scope as an American historian, as a scholar of the history of the Jews of the United States. If one actually were going to give a lecture on the history of hate speech, one would have to cover not only vast time and space, because my guess, because I don't know, is that there probably has been no society at any time, in any place, where some group of people were not the objects of hateful speech. If one were going to actually give a lecture on the history of hate speech in its global and temporal form, you would have to cover how has hate speech been defined? How has it been defined differently at different times and different places? What have been the responses or the reactions of the objects of such hateful speech? That is, how did people respond to the fact that somebody out there had said something that was hateful towards them? What solutions did they propose? To whom did they propose those solutions? Have there been historic circumstances in which an aggrieved party, that is a particular ethnic, racial, religious group, had ugly speech erased, removed, lessened, or banned? Did the objects of hate speech turn to government? Did they turn to public opinion? When, how, and so on. So that is certainly something that I cannot do. And so in my limited scope, I confess, as again a historian of American history and the history of American ethnicity and religion and the history of the Jews in the United States, I can say that volumes have already been written, sagging bookshelves of books that have documented how every single ethnic group in the United States, every single immigrant group, every group in the population other than those, shall we say, at the top, have been the objects of hate speech. And in particular, again, my specialty, the history of the Jews of the United States. So that's what I'm going to be concentrating on tonight. right, and I don't know if this is going to offer a model for how hate speech might be dealt with today. That I leave in a way to people who are in public policy, people in government, perhaps philosophers, but rather I want to ask, how did this group, okay, very small part of the American population, never more than 4% of all Americans, a group that had experienced hate speech since, one might say, the beginning of the Common Era, if not before, how did they respond to the hate speech around them? When did their responses change, and why? So I'm going to begin actually with a Dutch story, because here I am in the Netherlands, and I might give the same opening if I were giving this talk in Norway or Sweden or Germany, but I am in the Netherlands, so why not begin with a Dutch story? So the first group of Jews who came to America came in 1654. They came from the Dutch colony of Recife in Brazil, and they made their way to the colony of New Amsterdam, okay, which is now called New York. And they arrived in 1654, and they were met unhappily by the Governor General of the colony, a man by the name of Peter Stuyvesant. I'm sure that's not how it's pronounced in Dutch, but that's how we pronounce it in New York. We have Stuyvesant Place, Stuyvesant School, Stuyvesant Street, so to us, he's Peter Stuyvesant. And Stuyvesant did not want the Jews it was a group of 23 men and women, and he did not want them to stay in New Amsterdam because he said they were an accursed race. They were deceitful by nature. They were blasphemers. Okay, they were thieves. Okay, and they should not be allowed to stay. Okay, so I think that falls into the category of hate speech. Okay, well, this group of 23 Jews who had absolutely no standing with Peter Stuyvesant wanted to stay, and they wanted to stay because the colony was actually doing very well economically, and they hoped to be able to plant themselves in this particular port, which 10 years later is captured by the British, and it stops being New Amsterdam and becomes New York. But what could they do? Because they had no voice. They didn't have any standing with Stuyvesant. So the group of 23 Jews who had come to the colony, and Stuyvesant actually put them in jail, wrote to the Jewish community in Amsterdam, to the leaders, and asked the leaders to plead for them not to have Stuyvesant change his language. Not to ask Stuyvesant to say nice words about them, but to allow them to remain in the colony. So in their pleading, they were not concerned about hate speech, but rather they were concerned about policy. Can we stay? Can we trade? Can we build a community? Can we experience some level of equal rights? So as we think about hate speech, perhaps it's worth considering then what's going on in this very little story, which makes a very big place in American Jewish history, is the gap between ugly, hateful words and policies which put words into action. So American history, long after Peter Stuyvesant, has produced a compendium of words that expressed hatred for Jews and for Judaism as a religion, as it did for all ethnic groups, whether white or not, and for many outsider religious groups, Catholics in particular. And these words we could probably array on some kind of spectrum from casually hateful, if that's a real word, okay, a real concept, to viciously hateful, calling for violence, okay, calling for exclusion, calling for immediate bodily harm. In this, Jews were no different than other immigrants from Germany, Ireland, Sweden, Italy, Norway, and indeed from Holland, who actually were the objects of many hateful words in the 1850s, 1860s. All of these groups, at some point or another, were mocked for their physical, moral, and mental defects as perceived by some other part of the population. In the most part, though, what's important for all European immigrants who came to the United States, Jews among them, those words of hate did not spill over to being manifested in violence and mayhem. For most of the history of the Jews of the United States, from 1654 onward, and the history of the hateful words that were lobbed against them, the leaders, and I'm going to come back in a second to talking about who's a leader, who gets to speak for a group. The leaders of American Jewish communal bodies, whether religious or civic, chose a particular path to respond to verbal assaults. Okay, I should say these verbal assaults took place in newspapers, in stage, that is in plays, on screen, that is in movies, in state legislatures. Just one example, in the 1850s, a state legislator in California got up and said, the Jews who are here, they're not like other men. Other men go out into the gold fields and they get their hands dirty in the digging for gold. The Jew goes around and sells stuff. Okay, and he said they're not real men. The issue of shall we say, defamatory images and words towards Jews also took their place, by the way, in American classrooms. And again, let me just give an example. In the late 19th and early 20th century, American high schools, okay, that is below the college level, American high schools almost all assigned one play by Shakespeare. If you went to an American high school, you studied Shakespeare. Okay, and for much of the late 19th, early 20th century, that one play was not Macbeth, it wasn't Hamlet, it wasn't King Lear, it wasn't Julius Caesar, but it was The Merchant of Venice. Okay, with Shylock, okay, the Jew who demands his pound of flesh. So too, Americans loved, and high schools assigned as a mandatory curriculum a novel by Charles Dickens. Okay, again, great English writer, and the single most popular and the single most assigned book was Oliver Twist. Okay, and there was Fagin, the little Jew. Okay, with his hook nose, okay, as Shakespeare described him. Jewish students in these high schools, and they had a fairly high rate of attending high school, were confronted yearly with Shylock and Fagin. Okay, so the idea of, or the reality of hateful language, of hate speech, was all around the Jews of the United States, be it pretty much quite often when they picked up their local newspaper, when they decided to attend a play, when they picked up a magazine like Puck, when they went to high school and the teacher passed out the copies of The Merchant of Venice, and the like. Jewish organizations, and one of the outstanding characteristics of this particular group of people was that they created many organizations on the local and national level. They didn't particularly have a single body which spoke for them, but all of these organizations, to some degree or another, took up the issue of hate speech. And that it's as the B'nai B'rith, the American Jewish Congress, the American Jewish Committee, the National Council of Jewish Women, and on and on and on a national level, as well as in every community, pondered, what do we do about these ugly images that are in our community newspapers, that our kids are being asked to read when they go to high school. And there's Fagin, always had a slightly kind of image of a pedophile, because Fagin had all these little boys who he was working with, and Dickens kind of slightly sexualizes this relationship. What are we going to do about this? The various groups, and I just rattled off quite a few names, and the one that that was most important historically was an organization founded in 1913 called the Anti-Defamation League. That's its whole purpose, was to fight the defamation of the Jews in the public sector. All of these groups not only worried about what to do about hate speech, but they competed with each other as to who is going to be more effective in fighting it and who would be able to most effectively blunt the effects of hate speech. Nearly all of these organizations were funded in part with hate speech as the focus of their work. Now, there's strategies, and that's, I think, there's strategies which will be the core of what I'm going to be speaking about, were based on two realities. Okay, and first is that they were a really small group. Okay, they were tiny. They were a tiny drop in the ocean of the American population, and they knew that it was going to be very difficult to combat hate speech. Even though, by the way, that's a very contemporary word. They would have never used that. They generally use the word defamatory language. That they were going to have a very hard time fighting it, and they had to come up with a set of strategies that could blunt its pain. Now, they also had to deal with the recognition of the tremendous power of the First Amendment to the United States Constitution, adopted in 1790, which protects not people, but protects and doesn't protect groups, or doesn't even recognize groups except for Native Americans and slaves. But otherwise, it doesn't recognize groups of people, but it protects speech. It's the First Amendment to the Constitution, and in one phrase, it protected religion from government interference, it protected speech, it protected the press, it protected the protest, it protected the right of people to assemble. Courts, the courts of the United States at the lower level and at the Supreme Court level have, for the entirety of American history, well into the contemporary period, been very reluctant to ever limit speech. Okay, the court has never wanted to chip away at the constitutional principle. While the framers of the Constitution did contemplate some potential limits on speech, the court has always backed off from ever condoning any limit on what people could say. In 1942, Justice Frank Murphy summarized the law this way: there are certain well-defined and limited classes of speech, the prevention and punishment of which have never been thought to raise a constitutional problem. In other words, sometimes you can limit speech. He says, and these include the lewd and the obscene. America's always had very tough anti-pornography laws. Okay, the profane, which is kind of funny. Okay, the libelous. Okay, there's, I libel you, that I can, you can bring action against me. And his final words are very important. He said, what was not protected were, quote, fighting words. Okay, that is, those which by their very utterance inflict injury or tend to incite an immediate breach of the peace. So if I stand up and I say, let's every one of us here pick up our guns and go shoot so-and-so, those are fighting words. That's not protected. Another justice of the Supreme Court, Oliver Wendell Holmes, said that the only speech that could be banned was, as he put it, crying fire in a crowded theater. right? Because you stand up in a theater and you yell fire, everybody's going to run out. There's going to be a stampede. People will get hurt. And he coined the phrase, the speech that could be banned had to pose a clear and present danger. Okay, so speech which did not fall into any of those categories was protected. So let me just give one Supreme Court decision of 1969, which has not been changed in that lengthy period since then. The Supreme Court protected a Ku Klux Klan member's speech and created the principle of imminent danger to determine on what grounds a speech can be limited. The court ruled, and the case was called Brandenburg versus Ohio, that, quote, the constitutional principle of free speech and free press do not permit a state to forbid and prescribe the advocacy of the use of force or of law violation, except when such advocacy is directed to inciting imminent lawless action and likely to incite or produce such action. So the court has been extremely consistent on this. It, in the 1960s, protected the right of anti-war protesters to burn the American flag. Okay? Even though nobody liked it, or I shouldn't say nobody liked it, but the people on the court didn't like it. They said, it's their right, it's a form of speech, and it must be protected however offensive we find it. So American Jews throughout this long history trying to figure out how to deal with Merchant of Venice or Oliver Twist or the scurrilous words which appeared in newspapers, magazines, movies, plays, and so on, I had to contend with the fact that the government never came down on the side of protecting speech. It never came down on the side of banning speech because it was offensive to somebody. So here they are, a small group, surrounded by hate speech, and yet the constitutional system, which actually benefited them tremendously, didn't allow them to call for government to ban speech. Okay, so what did these organizations and the Jewish press and rabbis and other leaders of the Jewish community do when they were confronted with this speech? Well, the first, very much like the case of the Jews who show up in New Amsterdam, they went out of their way to plead, okay, that is to beg, to make their case to non-Jews, those who they believed had some goodwill, to use reason, logic, calls of fair play. So as an example, it was very common into the early 20th century that newspapers would publish a little item saying, Jew robs bank. All right, now, needless to say, they also said Negro robs bank. Okay, that was actually lasted much longer. But representatives of the National Council of Jewish Women in many cities organized small delegations to meet with the newspaper editors and say, you know what, would you publish an article that says Presbyterian robs bank? Lutheran robs bank? Okay, then why would you print Jew robs bank? Okay, or in another case in the 1950s, there was a Catholic priest by the name of Father Feeney who every day at the lunch hour would go into the Boston Common and stand up on a table and start ranting against the Jews. The Jews did this, the Jews did that, the Jews control the bank, the Jews control the world, the Jews have an international conspiracy, the Jews. And indeed, he was Father Feeney, and he usually referred to the Jews by a derogatory term of Sheeny. So everybody in Boston called him Sheeny Feeney. And so one individual, a man by the name of Samuel Pearlstein, who used to like to take his lunch in the Boston Common during good weather, which in Boston is not very often, but Sam Pearlstein happened to have a personal connection to the Archbishop of Boston, Cardinal Cushing, and so Pearlstein went to Cardinal Cushing and pleaded with him to demand that Father Feeney stop his Sheeny bashing in the Boston Common. Since Cushing and Pearlstein had a very close relationship, Cushing, now he has the power of the Catholic Church behind him, tells Feeney to stop. Feeney wouldn't. He defied his cardinal, so Cushing had him shipped off to another parish. So this is one strategy, which is pleading with people in positions of authority who could be in a way fronts for the Jews to fight defamation, because they understood that if they called for an ending of defamatory language in their own name, it would do no good. Another strategy, a second strategy, which became quite common and in fact was sort of the communal norm, is what we might call backroom, closed-door politics. That is, when there was some notorious or vocal anti-Semitic speaker, orator, radio broadcaster, television personality, other people in other positions of power or positions of public exposure, when they were carrying on about the Jews, the Jews, the Jews, small groups of well-placed Jewish communal leaders would meet behind closed doors with the offender and first say, it'd be really nice if you stopped. Okay, and usually were rebuffed, and then they would threaten, often economic action. Okay, so for example, and again, probably the most notorious is in the 1920s, Henry Ford. Okay, and you probably all know Henry Ford because I'm sure you know the Ford automobile, probably one of the most important industrialists in American history. Ford started in the 1920s to publish the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, okay, a notorious forgery which claimed that, again, the Jews, and anytime somebody says the Jews, they mean it's already defamatory because there is no such the. But Ford's publication of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion claimed that the Jews had a small cabal of elders who met. Somehow he figured out they decided it was in Zurich, Switzerland. And there they plotted the economic fortunes of the world. They engineered World War I. They had engineered the Boer War. And that was the document came out of Russia. It was published originally in the 1890s. It was a notorious forgery, but Ford thought, well, this makes a lot of sense, and he not only printed it in a newspaper he owned called the Dearborn Independent, but in the 1920s, if you went into a Ford showroom to buy a Ford automobile, there'd be a stack of these Dearborn Independents in the showroom. And indeed, every car that went off, you bought your car, you drove it off the lot, there was a copy of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion on the passenger seat. Okay, so now we don't know what people did with it. They could have thrown it in the garbage. They could have used it to wrap their debris. We don't know. But at some point, it became so annoying and problematic to American Jews in general that a number of well-placed individuals met with Ford, and they said to him, if you don't stop it, okay, we are going to call for a national boycott of all Ford products. Okay, so Ford, with a lot of resistance, did stop printing the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Another strategy that they engaged in was writing letters to the editor, particularly of newspapers that had and magazines that had published defamatory articles or defamatory cartoons. And the cartoons, by the way, were ubiquitous, of the Jew with the hooked nose, sunken chest, dark curly hair, usually very kind of grasping hands. And so they published letters to the editor showing the illogic, not just of anti-Jewish prejudice, but of prejudice in general. So again, rather than attack hate speech just in their own name, rather than saying we are hurt by this cartoon that appeared in your paper, or we are hurt by this article which appeared in your magazine. Rather, all forms of prejudice are wrong. And so what they did, and this is very much of a 20th century phenomenon, is they conflated anti-Jewish hate speech with all forms of hate speech. Okay, they published books against prejudice in general, articles that they put in magazines. They produced educational materials, films, radio broadcasts, television shows in the once television came to be so popular. And they were attacks on prejudice. And it didn't matter who was the object. The rationale of the Jewish opponents of anti-Jewish hate speech was use their ability to influence the American public through showing the illogic and ignorance that was inherent in all forms of hate speech and in all forms of prejudice. Okay, in addition, when and where they could, they did answer those hateful statements, usually compiling books and lists and statistics and figures to show, okay, that the proponents of these negative images were just wrong. So there was a whole discourse in the immediate period after World War I, which individuals, Henry Ford being one of them, claimed that Jews had not served in the military. Okay, and they served in the military at a lower rate than other Christian Americans, and that in the military they were cowards, that they ran away from the battlefield, and the like. So the American Jewish Committee compiled a book of thousands of pages. How somebody carried it to the library is, I don't know. And it was called The Jew as Patriot and Soldier. And it listed the name of every Jew who had fought in the American Revolution, the Civil War, both sides, the Mexican War, the Civil War, the War of 1898, World War I. It lists all the medal winners. It has tributes to the Jewish soldier by General Pershing and other military notables. So these books and other kinds of documents were to say, you know what, you're wrong. You're wrong. And with the hope that over time the accretion of evidence would quiet the perpetrators of the hate speech. Now, the final strategy that I want to offer, because it's going to be the one that will come to be most controversial in the period after the Holocaust, was a policy that we might, for lack of any better phrase, call quarantine. Okay, that is the advocates, people who actually didn't like it, who thought it was kind of cowardly and didn't accomplish anything, used a Yiddish phrase which was sha sha, which means quiet. Sha sha, be still. So quarantine, which basically was a view that anti-Semitic speakers, perpetrators of hateful speech, purveyors of those who were having rallies and parades against the Jews in some way or another, particularly in the 1930s and 1940s, and it continues after World War II, that these people, and I'm going to give one very specific example very shortly, that those people, they often call them demagogues, these purveyors of hate speech, wanted one thing. They wanted publicity. They wanted their pictures in the newspapers. They wanted articles. They wanted radio and TV coverage of their rallies. They wanted to be important. And so the Jewish advocates of a quarantine policy said the smartest thing we could do is we could be quiet, okay? We're not going to have a counter demonstration. Okay, we're not going to have picketers. Okay, we are not going to be out there and make noise when Gerald L.K. Smith or William Dudley Phillips or this whole range of speakers from, again, the 30s, 40s, 50s. We're not going to be out there when they're when they're spewing forth their hateful words, because if we go out there and try to counter them, then the press is going to come. And if the press comes, then they're going to get in the newspaper, and that's exactly what they want, and we're not going to give them the satisfaction. Ignore them, and eventually they're going to go away. So quarantine them. Okay, you can think of the image of a quarantine when there's an epidemic, and the person with the disease is put in isolation. Nobody makes contact with them, and presumably it's going to go away because the disease will play out its course, will run its course. Now, the Shah politics of the quarantine, which was the community norm. Okay, throughout the, particularly the decades before and right after World War II, that was the community norm. But after the Holocaust, and this begins to crack. And so it begins to crack at a number of moments in the 1950s, but it's particularly notable in 1959, when a man by the name of George Lincoln Rockwell created the American Nazi Party. Rockwell wore a stormtrooper uniform. He had the stormtrooper insignia on his armband, as did his followers, who he called the stormtroopers. When they walked in the street, even if they were going to buy a cup of coffee, they did the goose step and walked like real Nazis. And they were there on the American scene. Their talk, needless to say, was ugly. Okay, Hitler was right, he said. Okay, Hitler did the right thing. It's too bad he didn't kill more than 6 million. Okay, and if only Hitler had made it to the United States, we would have gotten rid of our 5 million of them, and then the world would be better off. Now, I'd say most Jewish communal leaders thought that Rockwell, who had a very small following, it isn't as though this was a mass movement with hundreds of thousands of stormtroopers goose-stepping along with him. It was a very small group. Most of the Jewish community insiders, the leaders, believed that the quarantine policy should just should be kept in place. And again, if Rockwell doesn't get the headlines, he's going to fade. And they also, by the way, worried that if, and this is in a way one of the common issues in dealing with hate speech, if we demand that Rockwell not get a permit to march, then someday somebody's going to use it against us. And so better off continuing with the quarantine. But a number of younger Jews in the post-war period and a very important group, small as they were, of politicized Holocaust survivors said, no, we don't keep up with this quarantine policy. After the Holocaust, we cannot keep up this low-profile way of dealing with demagogues like Rockwell. When he's out there, we're going to go out there. We're going to have our picketing. We're going to have our signs. We're going to march also. We are also going to demand that the city council of New York, Chicago, Boston, Washington, all places where he was active is a little extreme because, again, it was such a small group, but where he and his stormtroopers would show up at various times, and they applied for a permit to march. The younger Jews, the Holocaust survivors said, we're going to the government and we're saying, don't give him a permit. Okay, because we can't control if we're going to fight back, hence the imminent danger. Okay, that his mere presence is a matter of fighting words. His very presence on the street with his followers is provocative. It could cause violence. And as long as Jews feel endangered by Rockwell, they are going to feel that Jews are going to feel that they don't belong in America. Now, the problem was ultimately solved because Rockwell was assassinated by one of his own followers. So the problem went away. But in a number of cities, again, these dissident groups within the Jewish community did approach city leaders, the mayors, the city council members. They did try to get the permits revoked, or to get the city to not give Rockwell his permit, and they always lost. The city governments, again in New York and Boston and Chicago and Washington and Cincinnati and Cleveland, said, we have no authority, given the First Amendment, to deny him the right to march, just as we don't have the right to deny the Zionist Organization of America to march on Israel Day, or the Ancient Order of Hibernians to march on St. Patrick's Day, or the Sons of Italy to march on Columbus Day, or various African American groups to get permits for their protest marches. We can't deny him, just like we cannot deny others. So not all the same, that is, these other kinds of parades, but there was a certain political logic. Native Americans were always incensed by the Columbus Day parades. Now, they weren't a big organized group until the 1970s, but in many communities where they did have a presence, they said that the Columbus Day parade was hurtful to them because what did Columbus do? I mean, why are we having a parade for this man who, this European, who brought European colonialism to the Americas and led to the to our Holocaust? Many Americans of British background thought that the St. Patrick's Day parades were offensive to them as defenders of the British Empire. And certainly many white people were very upset by any marches by civil rights groups. And when civil rights groups said white people are doing this, that, or the other, I said, well, that's hurtful to me. And we as historians or people, the city councils said, we're not in a position to determine which march is hateful, which march is offensive. All people have the right to march so long as they stay within the law. The state, they said, should not be in the position of deciding whose speech might make some segment of the population feel uncomfortable. Some leaders, some actually Jewish leaders thought it was very important to have Rockwell march because they said it would teach the public what Nazism was. And many Americans who didn't know very much about the Holocaust and didn't know much about Hitler or the Nazis would have, we might say, a learning moment. The Rockwell incident, and I know some of you who are in Professor Topolsky's class have talked about Skokie and the effort of the Nazis to march in Skokie, and so many other events in the post-war period and into, indeed, even the contemporary time. For example, in the 1990s, giant rallies by Reverend Louis Farrakhan of the Nation of Islam, where he called Jews bloodsuckers. Okay, and that every Jew was out to exploit black people. On every one of those, the state has always said hateful speech cannot be banned, and let them march and let groups like American Jews and others try to use other kinds of means than banning speech. So drawing this to a close, the issue of hate speech has been one, although they didn't necessarily use that label, but let's call it hateful speech, has been a challenge for American Jews since before they were American Jews, but when they were just that group of 23 women and men from Recife who met Peter Stuyvesant on the docks of New Amsterdam, eager to be comfortable, eager to be part of a American society. These were people who knew that words could hurt, that words are complicated, but that not necessarily in the days of Peter Stuyvesant, but certainly after the drafting of the U.S. Constitution, in America, words are protected. So long as words don't become action, they are only words, and it becomes part of the burden carried by anyone who feels offended to come up with strategies. This is not my position, this was their position, and that can be part of our conversation. Their strategy was to say, so long as words don't become action, they are only words, and it behooves a group who feel offended to find ways to blunt their sting, to push them to the side. None of those strategies are foolproof, none are perfect, but since we can't enlist the state in banning speech, that's all we have. Thank you.